So I thought, well, I'm born into this, but what if it's not accurate? God's just too important. And the God I knew in my heart was really big. And I felt we downsized God a lot. And I just wasn't with that. So that took me on the journey of interfaith exploration for many, many, many years.
On In Good Faith, we believe that all faith traditions have something to teach us about how God is working in the world and in our lives. So join us as we listen and learn. Najah Bazzy left a career as a nurse to found Zaman International in 1996. I am so happy, Najah, that you have taken time to speak with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Steve. It's my honor.
I just want to fill in our listeners a bit that she's also been recognized worldwide, including as one of USA Today's Women of the Year in 2023, one of the top 6 Muslim female thought leaders by Global Woman magazine in 2022, and People magazine's Women Changing the World issue in 2020, and as a 2019 CNN hero. Really, that's quite a roster. The organization that I mentioned, Zaman, applies to a needs-based, community-driven approach to help households break the cycle of poverty through evolving education, workforce development, and employment programs at their Hope for Humanity Center in Inkster, Michigan, near Detroit. So, Najah, lots of us don't know this, but Detroit has one of the largest populations of Muslims here in North America. And so I do want to ask what it's like having a large supportive local community, but that's also a minority in the U.S.
Thank you, Steve. So it's actually the largest Arab American. So in particular, there's a city right outside of Detroit. It's called Dearborn. Everyone should know it. It's the hub of the Industrial Revolution and Mr. Henry Ford. It's where the first Model Ts came off the line. Actually, growing up in the Dearborn area was probably one of the things that most shaped life because you had immigrants that Ford was bringing from all over the world. So I grew up in this very multi-ethnic, amazing community where everyone looked after everyone else's child, even though none of them spoke English. And they formed kind of a collaborative and, would do just amazing things for one another. So your neighbor could be a Macedonian, an Italian, a Polish, a German, a Lebanese, and the list just goes on, someone from Yemen. And so that was really beautiful. But as I continued to grow and as the immigration process continued, yes, Dearborn became home to Arab America, basically. So what's cool about it, what's fun about it, is it allows you to manage your original family traditions. So my family's been in America 135 years, so we're on 5th generation. You can find everything that you might need. So I'm talking the best food possibly in this country. It's amazing. You just have access to all the cultural nuances. So that's been wonderful because it allowed a mosque next to a church, next to a temple, like that kind of diversity of faith, which has stuck with me.
That's really nice. And by the way, your family has been here 2 generations longer than mine.
Right. So most Americans do not understand Muslims immigrated to this country and really built America. And then the Arabs came much later than the Muslims did. So yeah, it's 5 generations deep. Those are my grandchildren.
That's great. Well, I wonder if you would tell me just a little bit, if I can ask personally, because I think this will show up in what you have done with your organization, how you were raised. Was your home a home of faith?
Actually, it was more of an Arab home than a Muslim home. So obviously my parents were Muslim. In my particular case, both my mom was born here in the United States and my dad. The grandmothers took their children back overseas because the grandfathers were here working and raised them there. And then they came back as teenagers. So when my mom and dad came here, they were very interested in holding on to Arab tradition and American tradition. And then I always say it's kind of like if you build a sundae. This is how I describe it. The first scoop was being Arab. The second scoop was being American. And then the cherry on top was being Muslim.
Mm.
Whereas for me, raising my children, it's totally flipped, right? So extremely more faith inspired, learning the difference between culture and faith. And that's one of the things I teach. People think that they're the same, and they're not the same.
Right.
Right? Because you can be Arab and be Muslim, you can be Christian, you can be atheist, you can be anything you want to be. Arab Jews. Whereas if you're Muslim, I mean, 1/5 of the world is Muslim, so that could be any nationality. But my parents were very strong in hanging on to the traditions, the Arab traditions, how to cook, how to clean, hospitality, how to entertain, the art of music, what we call adab, Steve, which is what I love so much about your faith tradition, raising your children with a sense of moral principles. So we were raised very much that way. But I kind of found faith when I went to college and decided to explore more and more.
So what was that like? So in college, yes, that's your chance to explore, maybe see a wider world, try on ideas. Interesting that took you deeper into your faith.
Yes, so I'm a 1960s child. I grew up with the race riots in Detroit. JFK assassinated. My dad was an army man. He was a medic in the army, and, the Beatles. And I think there was just a spiritual soul in me very young on. I remember distinctly swinging we were the only family that had swings. My mom and dad made sure that we had a swing because they had a swing when they used to swing from the tree in their hometown. So we had a swing set. And I remember swinging on that, singing like Let It Be and looking in the sky. And then whenever I would ask my parents a question, because they weren't literate in Islam,
Right.
They knew we fasted, they knew we had our holidays, but they weren't learned. They didn't have Sunday schools when they were growing up, right? And I'd ask a question and I was always told one of two things. Either it's a sin or it's wrong. And those were my two options, like shameful. Like you don't do this because, for example, dating. You would never date because it's a sin and it's shameful. You wouldn't wear provocative clothing because it's a sin and it's shameful. And I thought everything was a sin and shameful. So when I'd look up at the sky, that didn't conceptualize with me that everything was a sin and shameful. So I thought, well, I'm born into this, but what if it's not accurate? God's just too important. And the God I knew in my heart was really big. And I felt we downsized God a lot. And I just wasn't with that. So that took me on the journey of interfaith exploration for many, many, many years.
That whole idea of we downsize God, and I've heard people say it's a very small word for something very big.
Mm.
What was it you knew? How did you know? Or did you just instinctively feel some connection with God and what or who God was that you knew was bigger than that?
If I were to think about it and kind of rewind, there were a couple of incidences that didn't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
So the race riots was one of them. And that was on the border of Detroit and Dearborn. And the National Guard had to come to our area and they took over a park that we used to watch fireworks in, a neighborhood park. Mm-hmm. And there was mounted horses. The Mexicans and the Blacks were getting clubbed. I remember seeing that because my cousins lived in Detroit and they lived in a Mexican neighborhood, a very Catholic Mexican neighborhood. And there was a curfew and my cousins had left our home and my mom followed them knowing that they were going to get in trouble. And I was with mom in the car. So I saw the kids get clubbed and beaten. And that has left this very deep sense of injustice. And I remember distinctly thinking, like, why are they getting beaten up? And I realized somehow as a child that it was the color of their skin. But even as a child, I'm like, but God made them. Mm-hmm. And if God made them, because that's what we were taught, that God made us, well, then that's God's choice. So what's the problem?
Even as a girl, you could sort of feel the right and wrong of that.
I think as a child, you feel it more because you're more innocent and things aren't complicated. And race isn't yet institutionalized. At least in my family, it wasn't yet institutionalized.
You mentioned your father was a medic in the Army, and I don't know if that influenced you going into nursing. Did you see this as like a career that would please God? Were you even thinking that way at the time?
So, growing up as an Arab girl in my generation, they would get married early. Many wouldn't even finish high school. So, 16, 17, a few would finish high school, but I was not willing to go into these traditional roles. And I really wanted to become a doctor. And my dad, God rest his soul, he had this green canvas satchel, and you open it up and there were all these surgical instruments in it because he was a medic in the Army. I would play with it like crazy. And as a child, I was always doctoring everyone up, my siblings. And I also had a brother with muscular dystrophy who could not walk at all. He could not move at all. And he was 4 years older. So all of us siblings became his caregivers. And so medicine was instinctive to me by the time I was 15. Loved science. I could figure things out. It was like a clinical instinct almost. I could figure out how to fix things, whether I was listening or patching up the wound. I just knew how to do it. I think I inherited it from my grandmother because she was very much that person. My parents said, no, you cannot go to medical school. You're a girl. And back then, women were not really getting inducted into medical school. And it would have been Detroit, which my parents were not allowing me to drive to Detroit because back then, Detroit had a very bad rap for being the murder capital of the United States. So for all those reasons, I negotiated my way into a community college that was 10 minutes from the house, and I entered a nursing program. But yes, my father's Army kit had everything to do with, because I ended up going into surgical nursing and ICU and open heart. And I love those instruments till this day. I love them.
Well, let me ask you about the organization that you helped found. And I don't know if this was an outgrowth of the nursing or if it felt like a complete change when you decided to build Zaman International. And tell me what you hoped to accomplish when you first started.
So by that time, I was 36, a mother of 4. I had made my pilgrimage to Mecca, something I had wanted to do, graduated with a second degree in nursing, and I had a subspecialty. I'm a transcultural nurse. So I'm a critical care nurse, but then I have a specialty in transcultural care. And that particular area allows you to work across cultures and kind of conceptualize healthcare. And it was really designed for like third world countries and how nurses could go out into remote villages and understand how to cross-culturally administer healthcare. Well, I'm like, why do I have to go around the world to do that? In Detroit, the world is here and in our beds. So I struck a deal with the hospital that had offered me a position. And I'm a mom first, always. You know, I would say God, family, then everything else. And I told them, well, listen, if you'll let me build a clinical transcultural model that hasn't been done yet in this country, I will say yes, but I'll give you a 24-hour call. Because I was one, there was only one of me. So we did that. And basically, a refugee family from Iraq, from the Gulf War, had lost 13 of their family members in the Gulf War, had immigrated here under a refugee status, and had twins. And the one twin died immediately, and the second remained alive and was about 3 months old now, remained in the neonatal intensive care unit. But the anomalies of the infant were really severe. The baby was going blind, on a ventilator. The guts were born outside the belly. The baby was not going to survive. So the physicians decided that they needed to remove the ventilator. And that wasn't something that the family religiously could do. It was against their religious law. So I managed to negotiate a deal with the hospital, let the baby go home. And we would, help the baby die at home. And that was a miracle of God, Steve, because babies like that don't go home. And I managed to have hospice help me out. Hospice doesn't do that work. And that's why I know for sure I had nothing to do with this. I was just there, and God was answering a prayer because I had made it so often to make me his servant, the way he wants me to be, not the way I want to be. We got the baby home and I visited the house, and I found that there was nothing at the house at all, zero. And I thought they were moving in because, we think that way. And there was nothing. There was a styrofoam cooler, which is where the formula was, a propane stove, which is very dangerous, like a picnic stove. And when I saw the baby was in a laundry basket with clean white towels, and the baby was lying in there. They had created a crib. I didn't know that at the moment. So I kind of gasped for air and thought, what's going on here? Are they crazy? You don't put a baby in a laundry basket. Until my senses came to me and I realized that they actually built the baby a crib. So I left, cried my eyes out, called my mom. She's like big fat Greek wedding. She has 2 of everything, sometimes 3, and she's a humanitarian. And so I just rented a U-Haul, my kids and I, and we outfitted the entire house. And then the baby died several days later, so we buried the baby. And then I began to think about, not on my watch, where else is this? Mm. And that's how I began to learn about refugees and what was happening with them. And I felt really awful. I felt horrible because we were involved in the Gulf War and the Shock and Awe campaign. And I remember that campaign on TV, and it was shocking and awful. And I thought, if this is what we've done to these people, we need to repair this. So word just started to spread, and it was taking a refrigerator here and clothing here and this there, and then to food drives and so on and so forth. And here we are 30 years later, and it's a pretty large organization. It's a global organization. But here's the lesson. We often say that the ruling on the baby was futile. It was an issue of futility.
No point in trying to keep alive.
That taught me that quantity of life could be quality of life. And this legacy is this baby's legacy.
The whole organization.
The whole organization.
Wow.
Millions of people have been served, over 26 countries now, because of a one baby that we deemed futile. And so I think we have to be careful with the judgments that we place. And it made the work even more important.
Mm. Are there any particular needs after decades of doing this that seem to repeat themselves over and over until you think, if we could just solve these 1 or 2 things? Are there things like that keep cropping up?
That's a really important question to ask. That's very insightful of you. What I've learned as a student of these single moms, abandoned, abused, divorced, widowed, some are refugee, many are not, but they're all single moms. That's who our client is, living below $15,000 a year. What I've learned is like Maslow's hierarchy of needs. If you can take care of food, clothing, shelter within the first 24 hours, and you can lower the risk, then in that darkness, if you can solve that right away, then this is what I've learned. So to answer your question, what are the 1 or 2 things that keep repeating themselves? It depends on where you are. So in Michigan, we don't have a transit system like other states do. By design, this is the auto capital of the world, so they weren't going to build transit systems here. So transportation is going to constantly be an issue because they can't afford a car. And if they couldn't afford a car, they can't afford the insurance for the car. We're one of the highest rates of insurance. Childcare remains a big issue because if she wants to go to work and she's a single mom. The third thing that seems to repeat itself is they pull themselves a little bit up and they take a breath above this gloomy water that they're in. And then something can pull them down. When they constantly get pulled down, if you're not there to be that anchor, then they're just going to stay in that cycle. So we've learned that it takes about 2 to 3 years at a minimum to actually break the cycle of poverty because it's also up here as well as it is here.
I'm just wondering, I can't help but think that you have had moments where you have felt something spiritual, like this is God's work. God approves. Do you feel that sometimes?
I would say I hope so. I hope so. I guess that's the best way to put it. Sometimes I think God just got sick and tired of me asking.
Okay.
And he's like, okay, Najah, I hear you.
Uh-huh.
I'll create this pathway for you. What brings me to tears is the awesomeness of it all. It's hard to trust in that higher power all the time. But you learn that if you don't, you're really going to fall short because we do not have the full capacity to do this. There's a grace that comes along with it, but that grace requires sacrifice, a lot of sacrifice. I left a very lucrative paying job and haven't taken a cent from the organization. And that's not to pat myself on the back, but that's to say donor dollars, in my mind, have to be used for the mission. Now, of course, when there's another executive director, that person will 100% be paid. But I'm consciously aware that I have to also commit to sacrifice, to personal sacrifice in order to stay in the grace. My fear is falling out of the grace. There's a saint that we have in Islam. His name is Ali. He would be Prophet Muhammad's cousin, and also back there, his son-in-law back then. And he says it's not the good deed you do, it's how fast you do it. So I hold that all the time.
To act rather than hold back and wait.
Right,
Like I might
right.
get around to it.
I always say that I have been in these positions of seeing great love through our humanity, but also great incompetence. It's heavy because you could walk away. There's always that choice, and that's what sets us apart from the angels. They obey, and we have a choice. And so that's our higher intellect. So making those choices on a daily basis is something that is difficult and awe-inspiring, and yet being dependent, because you have to be dependent on donors and funding to do good, which seems odd, but that's our challenge, right? I mean, that's the human family, that's the system, that's how we should care for each other.
Well, I wonder in those difficult moments, or when you think, well, here I am waiting on God to see what will be provided or how things will work out. Are there particular, maybe a verse or a story, a chapter in the Quran or something that is like a touchstone for you, something that encourages you or you hold on to?
Yeah, there are several. So the Blessed Virgin Mother, for me, as a Muslim woman, is one of my role models and icons.
So Mary.
Oh, of course, because this is an organization for women. And a few things about her that inspire me and keep me moving. I use her as an intercessor. I know not everyone believes in intercession. I get that. I do. So as an intercessor, I see her, first of all, having been smarter than most of the rabbis of her time. She schooled most of them. You know, she was divinely inspired. God sent her sustenance. And then when she birthed Jesus Christ, peace and blessings be upon him and her, we have a verse in our Holy Quran that's not in the Bible. It's when she was turned away from her people and God asked her take a vow of fasting from words and from speech. In our Holy Quran, God commanded baby Jesus to speak and to defend his mom. And he does. He's a newborn. And he defends his mother and says, blessed be the day that I was born and the day that I will be raised. And that story of her and baby Jesus and the things that she had to go through, how do I quite describe it? It's as though she carried within her answers, and she carried within her the Messiah, and yet she was shunned and turned away, and she maintained her dignity. That ability to hold herself, which was given to her by God, that is something that pushes me every single day because it was against the tide. And she birthed the miracle. And I feel like Zaman, in many ways, the baby that I was talking about earlier was kind of the birthing of Zaman as a miracle to serve in the world. And another story that drives me is Prophet Abraham, because there's a beautiful story where, you know, he always wanted to eat with people. He always had people eating with him. And one man came to him and he was dining with him. And then he discovered that the man did not believe in God. So Abraham dismissed him, and God sent Archangel Gabriel to him right away and said, God says to you, O Abraham, that he knows that this man does not believe in him, but he continues to sustain him, invite him back. So that story of like, it's not for me to place judgment on whether someone believes in God or not. It's my job to feed people. God is the great sustainer, and he's provided the food, and we're just the agents of his goodness.
So much good I see reflected in what you're doing. I do see where you tie into those scriptural precedents to do what you do. I think that's very beautiful, Najah.
If these are the words of God, if we believe they're the words of God, then certainly I'd rather listen to his advice than anyone else's. So the challenge, though, is to stay in the, what we call it tawakkul, to stay in the mindset of dependence on God. And that's a little difficult, Steve, because we're raised, especially in this country, independent, 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 independent. Yeah. And, your relationship with God is interdependent and dependent. And so it's trying to always say, especially in difficult times, Lord, this is your work. It belongs to you, not to me. I give it to you as a trust, as all I can do. And then settle down. Quiet that craziness in us.
This episode was produced by Heather Bigley. Our production team also includes Aaliyah Ebert, Katarina Martinic, and James Sturdivant. Our post-production sound designers are Mark Hansen, Ashton Parkinson, and Lauren Sandberg. Spread the word about In Good Faith by leaving a comment and subscribing wherever you get your podcasts. In Good Faith is committed to the idea that we all benefit from hearing people of widely varying backgrounds share their personal experience with faith and belief. We think people with such experience deserve some of our best listening. Find us on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram. Our YouTube page is youtube.com/@in-good-faith. In Good Faith is a production of BYU Radio. I'm Stephen Cap Perry. I hope you join us again soon, right here in Good Faith. Hi, I'm Stephen Cap Perry, host of In Good Faith. Nothing captivates me more than people setting out on an adventure, especially if it's a place I wish I could go to or a subject I wish I knew more about, but I don't live in the right place or I don't have the equipment or the expertise. I'm telling you about a podcast from our BYU Radio family of podcasts, an award-winning podcast called Constant Wonder. With host Marcus Smith, you'll be expanding your horizons on all kinds of discovery. It could be science, it could be art, history, and more. Do you need that feeling of awe and wonder in your life more? I do, and I love it when I see how to experience that by hearing the stories of people who are doing and exploring all of those things that are so interesting to me. Check out the podcast, Constant Wonder,